Hello and welcome back to Southbank Live. My name is Boaz Shoshan and I'm joined as ever by John Butler. John, how are you getting on this evening?
Very well, Boaz. Thank you.
Yeah, it does seem a little change of attire for you, John. Instead of the turtleneck, you got the scarf on this evening.
It is quite cool. The temperature's dropped. I don't know if you noticed, but we're in for a chilly couple of days.
Yeah, it shall indeed be rather breezy. Good evening to all who have joined us for this episode of Southbank Live. It's great to be here and to do this live show as we have for quite a few episodes now. So the whole purpose of the show, for those who are new, is to discuss some of the major market and investment themes, some of the geopolitical themes as well of the week, looking through some of the news, and at the same time to take some questions, some comments live from our audience. So a big hello to all who have joined us this evening. And indeed, if you're watching a recording of this, it'd be great if you could give us a subscribe and a like, because that does help us out. Very good evening to Andrew, who says hello. And indeed, we do have a comment from our friend David saying to stay off from the American topics this evening. This evening, David, I can assure you that we shall be sticking mostly European, but we'll see where the conversation goes. Something I'd like to start off with, John, this evening is over the last week, we've just seen so much stuff about cybersecurity and cyber attacks. And this is something that I find very, very interesting. I have plenty of friends who work in cybersecurity. It's one of the few industries that millennials seem to be doing incredibly well in. And it seems to be a great time to be working in the industry because there's so many attacks going on. So if we just take a look at a couple of the headlines from this week. This is from Reuters. Norway claims their parliament was attacked digitally by the Chinese Communist Party. Meanwhile, over in Ukraine, there was another big slew of attacks, which the Ukrainians have linked to Russia, of course, given the great conflict they have there. Now, there's plenty we can discuss here, John. I'd just like your take, sort of just taking the temperature of both of these things. What do you think is going on here, and what should we take from it? Because ultimately everyone's plugged into the internet these days, and the more of a war zone the internet becomes, it seems more dangerous for all of us.
Well, certainly. I mean, information warfare is as old as recorded. The recorded history of warfare. It always plays a role. That said, the role tends to be obscure, and it is in some cases probably never fully understood. In retrospect, it's lost. Right? It's lost in the sands of time. And certainly today, given the internet is used for just about everything in some way, it's only understandable that there would be attempts at the state level, right, at the international level, to at least prepare for, if not necessarily execute, actions that would hopefully at least confuse, if not disable, one's opponents from being able to use the internet the way in which they would want to use it. Now, of course, there are private networks that exist, especially in the world of national defense. But it's worth pointing out that nevertheless, there are things that could be done that would be very disruptive. I mean, think about it. What if you find ways to disrupt the energy grid and electrical grid? What if you find ways to disrupt navigation tools and location tools? I mean, again, some of these things can be done totally off internet. And indeed, it's important that you have redundant systems that allow you to do that. But a lot of stuff, you can certainly mess around, right? And so when we think about cybersecurity, we usually think about private business. And yet, it could well become something that in future becomes a primary, not just sort of incidental secondary instrument of international warfare, kind of as you've said before, a fifth generation or fifth level or fifth dimension of warfare.
Yes, it does feel like this is going to be a really big theme in the 2020s. I feel that cybersecurity, while there's been plenty of chatter about it, rightfully so, ever since the noughties, really. But going through the 2010s, this became much more of a theme. You saw more publicly listed companies, which were in this space, which made it an investment theme as well. And now I do feel like it's going to be a really good time for cybersecurity investors as well as people working in the cybersecurity industry. But this is generally not for a very good reason, right? It's like being
Well,
in the
look,
business of
look,
making guided missiles.
the security industry in a private sense, think Brinks, think Loomis, think these companies that are are responsible for the custody and transportation, secure custody and secure transportation of some of the most valuable stuff in the world. And they take this very, very seriously. I mean, I have worked with both of those firms, not for them, but with them in various capacities in the past. And the degree of professionalism is unbelievable. So it doesn't even need to be at the national security level. It can just have to do with private
Yep.
business. It's an old industry and a very interesting industry. And while, yes, of course, nobody wants to have to pay for security, but then nobody wants to have to pay for insurance. Nobody wants to have to pay for national defense, but it's reality. It's reality. And sometimes the amount that people feel they have to pay for these functions is disproportionately high. And that can make those sectors safe haven sectors. And so one could say, and of course, that I've been bearish big tech for a year at least, right? Better early than completely wrong. But in any event, you could say that within the tech sector, cybersecurity is a relative safe haven, perhaps, given this world that we've entered? Food for thought.
Yeah, certainly. I think I agree with that. I think it comes with this the meld, I guess, between defensive stocks. So people love buying sort of national security, Lockheed Martin, that during recessions because they've got so many good connections with the government, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's kind of a halfway house between defense and with growth tech names when you have cybersecurity in general. So I find that the sector very interesting. There is an ETF for this called, which has the very fitting ticker hack, which I always look to as generally just as a proxy for the sector. And interestingly, I think it reached an all-time high in November, but now it's seen a very, very sharp sell-off. And I do wonder what will lie in store for it. As I said earlier, I've got quite a few friends who I went to school with who then ended up working in cybersecurity. And it seems to be a very, there's so much growth for them, just in terms of their own employment prospects. A friend of mine who I spoke to recently, I caught up with him, and he said, this is one of the only sectors out there where there's 0% unemployment rate. So if you're not getting a really big pay rise every year, then you can just move and you'll get one at a different firm, which is, as millennial job prospects go, there aren't many others where you can make that kind of comparison. But going specifically to the case of Norway and China, John, would you care to speculate what it might be? What was it that the Norwegians did to provoke such an attack?
Well, first of all, when it comes
I
to
know it's a big
cyber,
question.
well, look, when it comes to cyber warfare, when it comes to information warfare, and again, this goes back throughout history. It's not just the case today. It's actually extremely difficult to be entirely certain precisely what happened, who did it,
Yep.
and what was the intention. You can guess, and you can make an educated guess, and if you do enough investigative work, maybe you eventually answer all of those questions with a high level of certainty. But it's very difficult. And when I see headlines like that, the first questions I ask are, cui bono sort of questions, right?
Yep.
And it's not. It's not immediately obvious to me why China would do that. And it's also not immediately obvious to me how Norway could be so certain so quickly that indeed it was a Chinese attack. I mean, it's way more complex than that,
Yeah.
right? It's not that easy that quickly to be so certain. So it makes me wonder, there are at least two agendas here. There's the Norway, for whatever reason, went public with a story so quickly when I doubt they could be 100% certain. So there's kind of one narrative there I can't believe is definitive.
Yep.
And then you have to ask yourself, well, okay, even if that's correct, then what possible reason could China have to do that? It's not immediately obvious to me. And so I think it's you can't just say, oh, gee, that's bad. They shouldn't have done that. We don't really even know exactly what happened or why. So it's way too early to rush to judgment on that. And regarding the Russia-Ukraine thing, look, I'm going to be a bit cynical here, but almost the whole world, given the potential scale of that, given that it's NATO versus Russia, and given that China and Russia obviously cooperate increasingly in security matters, every major country in the world has an interest in this. And the idea that I would believe anything coming out of either Russia or Ukraine and take it at face value that, oh, they're telling the truth, they actually know what's going on, who's involved, what the purpose is. You know what? I have no idea. It's
Yeah,
almost impossible to know what's really going on there.
exactly. It's extreme bias on both sides, and everyone's got an agenda.
Exactly. Don't
Yeah.
believe anything like that you read. We're only going to know in retrospect, and we may never know in retrospect what really happened or why.
Especially when so much of it is just written on the internet in the first place, and this is its own domain of
Indeed.
warfare and
Indeed. So
propaganda.
be very, very skeptical what you see right now when it comes to stuff like that.
Yeah, it's very interesting where where you can't really trust what it is you're reading. I mean, in a lot of ways, you can't trust what you read anyway, and you should always have a certain certain level of
Yes, but this
cynicism.
is particularly so, right? This is where even if the Norwegian government thinks and security service, even if they think they know, I'm not sure they could. I'm not sure that they're 100% certain. And indeed, if you got them, in a private conversation, I think they would say, "Well, we're guessing."
Yeah.
That's where I think it's at.
It just adds another level of grayness, I guess, to the cybersecurity sector, because ultimately, even you can get very very good educated guesses, but anyone can originate, so long as they're connected to the internet. You can originate a cybersecurity attack, a cyber attack, from anywhere else that's connected to the internet. You can use tools that you've stolen from other countries, which then make it look like that attack was done by a different country. So it's all very very vague. And it does make for a great conversation, because of course we can speculate to the nth degree as to who it was, and whether or not it was China. Maybe it was North Korea. They have a very very entrepreneurial hacking class. I remember there was an interesting article written on the North Koreans, where you get these guys who are based in China, but they're employed by the North Korean government, and their job is they need to make $1 million in some kind of on the internet. However you want to do it, you need to make the North Korean government $1 million a year, and if you make more than that, you can take 10%. So it's very interesting commission based kind of job, but very very 21st century, isn't it? Now, just been looking through the chat, very rather lively chat this evening. We have got some people shilling XRP, the cryptocurrency. So great to see that we have attracted the crypto spammers into the chat. That's a shame. Pro Rogers, I believe, is the culprit this evening. But we do have some folks saying hello to Andrew. Very good evening to you. Says hello, and indeed to Jonathan. And Robin suggests, John, that you should be wearing a hat as well. Though I think you'll be fine just with the scarf. Damien, good evening. Thanks for joining us, and Julian indeed as well. Now, moving slightly on, I think I'd like to go. Sort of transition sideways here to once again to the Ukraine Russia conflict. So another story this week, which I think is very especially relevant to us here in the UK. This was a news article regarding the sales of arms from the UK to, well, not necessarily the sale, but they were transferred and sent to Ukraine, and this was done avoiding Germany along the way. The British Army took a rather circuitous route in order to deliver these, I believe, it was anti-tank missiles and things like that. And this is this is quite a bold move by the British government there. I was wondering what your take was on that, John, because ultimately this is becoming really raising the tension here. And as an investor in the UK, or if you're got exposure to sterling, things like that, ultimately, what your government's doing does have an impact on you and the economic stability, and indeed the market stability of your own assets. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, look, again, it's very difficult as an investor to trade on what amounts to almost pure uncertainty. Nobody knows what's going to happen here. However, we do know, and there's increasing publicity on both sides, NATO/Ukraine on the one hand, and Russia on the other, that they're not hiding the buildup. They're not hiding the weapon shipments. And you can do these things covertly, or you can do them very, very publicly. And so there is this sort of dynamic right now where there's a lot of overt stuff taking place, which has to do, presumably, with backing up the negotiating positions on both sides. And so say, hey, yes, we are moving weapons, but you are too, and it's all, it's pretty much out in the open. One thing that was interesting is that when I first heard on the news headlines, and I believe it was Monday morning, rarely does something like that get mentioned as a major headline, at least on my morning news channel that I tend to listen to. And it was, I think, the third item was that the UK had decided to send these advanced anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. And that seemed pretty far up the list. So clearly, a decision was made in Whitehall to send this message loud and clear to the entire world that they are sending these advanced anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. And sure enough, I'm a bit of a plane spotting junkie. And so later that day, when I was finished with work, I went on a website that allows me to track all the air traffic in Europe. And sure enough, there were RAF C-17s. There were 3 flights that afternoon and evening. And the next day, Tuesday, there were 3 more flights that I saw, and there might be some that I didn't see. But a C-17 is not a small aircraft, okay?
No.
And so, that's a lot of airlift that's been going on this week. And it's very obvious to everyone. So NATO, which of course includes the UK, is really digging its heels in here publicly. And Russia is doing the same. What did Russia announce this week? Snap drills with their neighbor Belarus. Now, that is unbelievably provocative if you look at a map. And we don't have a map graphic to show here, but let me just explain a little curiosity about the geography. There is a narrow Belarusian salient into the northern part of Ukraine, right where the Dnieper River is. It's actually close to where the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was.
Right.
That is only about 50 miles from Kiev.
Right.
Think about that. The Russian army and Belarusian army on joint exercises only about 50 miles from Kiev. That's 30 miles from artillery range.
Right.
Whoa. Okay, that's provocative. So look, both sides are being very provocative here, and it frightens me. So look, as an investor, what do? I mean, how do you trade something like that? It's impossible to know. All you can say is that the level of uncertainty is elevated, and seeing as how I'm defensive anyway, it's just one more reason to be defensive right now.
Yeah, it does feel like it's becoming harder and harder for investors and the investing press to avoid this conflict. We've discussed cybersecurity as one of the things where if things did go awry with Russia and Ukraine, you could end up with internet outages in various parts of the world when things go crazy. Yeah, but you don't. It's impossible to totally predict ahead of time. There's that story about the chap who in the 1920s, a Frenchman, I believe he lived in Paris, who he saw ahead of time that Europe was destined to enter another world war, and that Germany was going to become another big force, and it was just going to cause another great conflict. And so he decided that he wisely decided, I need to leave Europe. And so he takes his family and he travels to the most remote part of the world that he can think of, which just happens to be the small island in the Pacific called Iwo Jima, and which of course then happens to be
oops.
Oops, right? But he got the call completely right, but you never really know the way things are going to turn out. So Iwo Jima, of course, becomes one of the most.
This is true. This is true of investing generally. You can get the economy right. You can even get the policy decisions right. You can get all kinds of things right. And yet at the end of the day, you have to buy an actual security, an actual futures contract, or sell if you're going short. Yep. And there is always an element of the risk, the execution, how you specifically choose to execute a view for whatever reason does not fully line up in the way you thought with the underlying general view, no matter how correct that general view is. And believe me, as someone who's traded financial markets, macro primarily, but also a bit of micro, as someone who's done that for much of his adult life, both professionally and privately, personally on the side at times. Look, there are some general views that I got absolutely correct, and yet I failed to make any money just
Right.
because the execution was. And this is something all investors need to ask themselves. Now, when I do write an investment commentary, I generally try to do what I call build the bridge. That is, you try to build the bridge between the general view on the one hand and a specific, actionable, practical trade idea on the other. But no matter how well you build that bridge, there's always a risk that it just doesn't work, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, when you're discussing it, when you put it in those terms, it reminds me of some of the guys who actually got the trades right in 2008 for the Big Short, but they couldn't actually exit their positions because everything seized up. Their brokers, their counterparties, the banks that they deposited the money in, they all ceased to trade, and so you couldn't exit the position, so they couldn't actually take their profits. So even though they were completely right, and on paper they had made vast fortunes, in the end they didn't make any money out of it, which must have been incredibly frustrating. I
Well,
can
this is,
barely
and this
imagine.
is the other thing, right? Is that history does demonstrate that occasionally, when something big is going down in financial markets, governments do not sit aside and they get involved. And they make sure that they are able to protect what they regard as systemically important firms. And in some cases, they will burn the speculators on the other side of those trades.
Yeah.
And there are many examples of that happening. And so, yes, even in execution, you can be correct on the one hand, but then the government comes in and says, sorry, we're not going to pay out on the other. So it can happen that way.
Quite. Now, just looking through the chat, we have got some very interesting questions this evening,
Sure.
and so that's it's very nice comments. Robert, good evening. I'm glad to see you again in the chat, and finds himself looking forward to these episodes, which is great to hear. It is good to have our sort of regular viewers join us these evenings. Stephen asks, is cybersecurity a price taker or a price giver? Would such stocks be a good inflation hedge or not? Which I think is a very, very good question, especially that second part of it. So as we were sort of discussing, within tech, John, you reckon that cybersecurity firms could be as much of a safe haven as you can get within the sector. It's always interesting with the idea with tech and with inflation. Tech and inflation generally shouldn't go that well together, or inflation and growth stocks should not go that well together. Many tech stocks are growth stocks. What do you think? Say, for example, this inflationary environment persists for quite a long period of time, as we both expect. And just this week we've seen even better inflation statistics coming out. The numbers just keep going up.
Oh, yeah.
How do you think that sector really will perform if we see this, go for the next decade? So, do you think you'd grow your capital in the sector, or is this something that would manage to keep its value? What do you reckon?
Well, for reasons we've already sort of discussed, I think that cybersecurity as a subsector within tech is on a secular growth trend, which is going to allow it to behave as a somewhat uncorrelated asset to the general macro cycle. And to the extent that big tech has at least some general macro correlation, I think that again is a good way both to diversify, that is to overweight cybersecurity, to diversify and to participate in secular growth during what could be a very challenging environment for big tech. Now, when I say big tech, it's the problem with the whole tech sector now, right, is that it actually encompasses so many other sectors. It's actually becoming a mistake just to
Yeah.
lump it all together. And I fault myself for doing that now and again. And so when you look back at the history of tech vis-a-vis inflation and growth versus value, tech back in the 70s, in the stagflation, it really was concentrated in computing and processing power, really just in speeding stuff up. It wasn't yet permeating lots of other industries. Of course, eventually it will. And now look where we are today. But
Yep.
the funny thing is, if you look at a company like Microsoft today, I mean, it's getting to the point where you can almost regard Microsoft as a public utility. And to some extent, that may also be true, less so, but I think to some extent it may also be true of Google, Alphabet, for example. That is, these are companies that it's almost impossible to go through and live a normal life anymore without some exposure to their product. Just like you have to have your electrical firm, you got to have your water supplier, okay, your utilities. They're just necessary industries. That said, in tech, they're still relatively unregulated, whereas public utilities, when it comes to energy and water and whatnot, are generally quite highly regulated industries. But
Yeah.
anyway, getting back to this cybersecurity topic, not only is that sector essentially unregulated, it does, I believe, have this potential for secular growth, and as a defensive source of secular growth, I think it's an ideal place to rotate into for people that up to now have simply been riding the general big tech, train that's done so well in recent years.
Yeah, that is it does feel like something we're going to see an awful lot more of. As I referred to, the fact there's only a couple of cybersecurity ETFs, for example, there aren't that many publicly listed like pure cybersecurity companies out there. But it does feel like it's something we'll see a fair bit more of, and maybe
What, what,
probably a
one
fair
thing,
bit.
one thing to consider, however, and this is something one always has to keep in mind, it is possible that an existing, more traditional security firm or defense firm will look to acquire
Yeah,
a cybersecurity company. So there's some buyout opportunity here. You mentioned Lockheed Martin earlier. What if Lockheed Martin decide they want to buy up some up and coming cybersecurity firms so they can add that add that arrow to their quiver? This is anyway. It's something to keep in mind that there are a lot of upstarts. It's difficult to get exposure, but the potential is there that some of them get bought up, and so you might want to just get a general exposure, regardless of the specific story in each case, in the hope that that you get bought out at some point.
on the topic of tech buyouts, this isn't cybersecurity related, but we did see Microsoft earlier this week buy Activision Blizzard. I believe it was $68.7 billion. Pretty big payout. I still don't understand why they couldn't have just made it $69 billion, much nicer, rounder figure. But $68.7 billion. I'm sure there was a lot of gamers there who are very happy. I was wondering, what does this say about tech in general when you're seeing that, and I guess the video game sector in general, when you're seeing this size of acquisition? Would you have any comment on that, John?
Well, let's keep in mind, right? Your big tech firms. I mean, they're sitting on piles of cash. I think Apple's might be the biggest, but I
Yeah.
mean, they're all sitting on huge piles of cash. Now, that said, a lot of that cash is financed with debt. They've added a lot of debt to the balance sheet. So it's not just retained earnings. Some of it is basically a form of leverage. And this is why some people began to call Apple the world's largest hedge fund,
Yeah.
because because they had all of this cash, and they started to invest in almost anything. It didn't even have to be tech anymore. So you've got all that cash, and they're always looking for a home for it. And certainly within tech itself, they snap up promising IP. They'll snap up and coming firms to acquire that IP. In some cases, those up and coming firms already have a small client base. In some cases, they have no clients at all, but they just want the IP. And this is, there is a lot of cash sitting around. If they get more active deploying that cash, then of course other factors equal, and this is just the way the world of equity investing works. Other factors equal, that should lead to a relative hit to their valuations vis-a-vis the targets they're acquiring. Because
Yes.
you almost always have to pay a premium to go out and shop around like that and to buy up other people's IP. So, usually that's what happens when you get into a really active merger and acquisition phase. You see some relative leveling of the valuations in question. And it could be yet another sign that big tech see fewer opportunities now for organic growth driven by themselves.
Yeah.
And they're looking to kind of cash out and diversify a bit, which again, if you look at the history of conglomerates as businesses, it does suggest that their valuations are likely to drift lower in that sort of environment.
Yeah. When you made the comment about Microsoft effectively becoming more like a public utility,
Some aspects of it, yeah.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, if they got 69 billion to just buy the world's biggest video game company, why not? Why not? And then you've got even more exposure to all the things that everyone does. Certainly a sector similar to cybersecurity that's had a great time over the past during the lockdown period because everyone's just staying at home, staring at their computers all of the time. Now, if we're just taking another look around, look through the comments. Liam says, hello, Boaz and John. Hello, Liam. Good evening. John was right about investing in infrastructure. And Liam reads that railways should overtake roads or will overtake roads as the main way of transporting freight in the future. Have you got any comment on that, John? Because you're very big on the infrastructure story.
I am, and actually, railways are an interesting one because from an engineering and energy perspective, in principle, they're super efficient. The way it just has to do with the kinetics of a railway. It takes a long time for a train to accelerate, but once it reaches cruising speed, it takes very little incremental energy to move a huge amount of freight, a very long distance. Now, this is assuming the ground's flat. Obviously, if you've got hills to deal with, that changes the picture a bit. But in any event, it's just unbelievably efficient. The problem is actually, oddly enough, because a lot of the rail technology, when it comes to safety and speed, is pretty archaic and hasn't been upgraded. So you can have all of this theoretical logistical capacity, but if only you could run trains a little bit faster and a little bit closer together and still do so safely, you could almost exponentially increase the amount of freight you could move over distance. And this is actually something they call it smart railways, the same way they talk about smart motorways and whatnot. There's actually people working on this. And I don't know quite where things stand, but if there is a significant breakthrough that allows better signaling, GPS applied, automatic braking, auto this, auto that, who knows what it might be, to allow trains to run a little bit faster and a little bit closer together, that could be a real game changer. Making those sorts of improvements to an existing network is a hell of a lot easier to do in principle once you've got the tech than adding a new lane to a motorway or for more lorries and adding more lorries and whatnot. It's just not as efficient. So that is something that I know people have been working on for years. This concept of smart railways, and I don't know of a specific firm that claims to be a market leader in that area, but the whole industry is in theory positioned to benefit if they can squeeze out more logistical capacity from what is already kind of an existing network, just waiting to be upgraded.
Yeah, when the capital expenditure has already been made effectively, and just getting the rails down there, it does make you wonder just how much more efficiency can be brought to bear if you just apply a lot of automation and things like that to it. I mean, if people are happy with automated cars driving around the roads,
indeed,
why not trains? I mean, it's not like there's less chances of them hitting another train, I suppose. One question from David here, which I think is very apropos, though it does go back to our comments that the answers to what lies in the future are written on a postcard. Do you think that China is more likely to invade Taiwan if the USA is distracted by Russia? Now, that is a double-barreled question there, David. Probably that's a one gauge question there. But what do you think? What do you think, John? Do you think China is more likely to invade Taiwan if the USA is distracted by the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Okay, look, this is not a prediction of any kind, and I'm not an expert on this, but other factors equal yes. And the reason why I say that is because the history of international multinational warfare is that countries frequently throughout history have opportunistically jumped on the opportunity to try and achieve whatever small specific goal they might have when they feel that one or more of their enemies are distracted with something else. A great example of this is the 7 Years' War, which some people call the First World War, where practically every country in Europe takes advantage of what starts as a small-scale confrontation between the remnants of the Holy Roman Empire and France and whatnot. And then everyone jumps in because everyone's trying to achieve something here, something there, something there. Even in North America, you had the colonial wars that kicked off. In World War I, very, very similar. I mean, it's amazing. Even in Africa, countries went to war with each other. Some of
Right.
them, of course, were related to the colonial settlements, but others were seeking independence, and they took advantage of that to try and break away from the British Empire. Some joined in with the Germans because the Germans promised to liberate them. So what starts out as a skirmish, obviously concentrated in Central Europe, goes global. And World War II
Yeah.
was even more global than that. I mean, there's hardly a single country that didn't take up arms at some point to either achieve some local objective or to defend itself against someone else trying to do the same. So that it's just the way the chessboard kind of moves. It's just the way it plays out. If NATO gets really tied down in Central and Eastern Europe as a result of this frightening spat building in Ukraine, then who knows? Maybe China will think that this is their big chance. But again, I'm not an expert on this, and it's hardly a prediction.
But yeah, it is right to point out just how everyone's got some kind of foreign policy agenda, or all of the large military players do, and they will take any opportunity that they can to advance it. We do have a question here from Apple, which I think is very interesting. Hello, John and Boaz. What do you think of space defense companies? I really enjoy your chats. Thank you. Oh, well, thank you for tuning in, Apple. This is it's great to have you here. Very good question as well. Space defense companies. My general response would be there aren't that many of them, and as a result, people who it's a really cool exotic sector. They get these very high valuations because they fall into tech as well, and they've got these cool, ambitious ideas. So there aren't too many of them, and the valuations are quite can be quite high. One of the things I sort of bemoan is the lack of publicly listed companies these days. So there are actually a lot of space businesses out there, ones that service the space industry, but they're not necessarily publicly listed. So, for example, back during the Cold War, there was a stock you could buy called the Marquardt Corporation. And all Marquardt made were rocket motors that were attached to satellites and other space vehicles. Like that was the only thing they did. So it was this, incredibly concentrated pure play on effectively, space exploration, space defense, all the Star Wars plays that took place between the Soviet Union and the US. So, if you just wanted exposure, you could just buy Marquardt stock. But these days, it's a fair bit different. So you get companies like Maxar, which are really big into space, but there aren't very many of them. And then what they do is a big collection of various things. They have lots of different clients. Of course, some of the really exotic stuff they can't tell you about because it's national security. So I think it's a really interesting sector. But when it comes to investing in it, it's you do need to be very you need to do your own due diligence and make sure that you really know what it is that you're buying. John, what would you say to that in terms of space defense?
Yeah, but I mean, again, some ideas sound great on paper, but as you point out here, right, the practicalities of actually getting invested can be difficult, and some areas really are only accessible through private equity, venture capital, SPACs, say. But in some cases, right, some of these things do eventually get listed, and then it's easier for the general public to get involved. So, look, on paper, space defense sounds fascinating, and certainly the space race, which began, way back in the 50s, if you really want to go all the way back,
Oh yeah.
has continued. And I remember when China blew that satellite out with that missile, completely taking the world by surprise. That I remember that, and I remember thinking, like, wow. The militarization of space is really going to accelerate now, whether we like it or not. And and so certainly I would argue that the amount of money being spent on space defense is only going to keep going up, and probably keep going up disproportionately more than more conventional forms of defense. I think that's a fairly safe assumption. But as you say, exactly how you execute that sort of view, implement that sort of view, is not straightforward for the typical investor. And I wouldn't I wouldn't be able to come up offhand with a short list of companies that are concentrated in that. That said, you could take a look at existing listed defense contractors, and certainly some of them probably at least claim to have sizable and growing space defense operations, and so you can at least get some exposure that way.
Yeah, as a theme, like as something that is definitely going to happen to the world, like space defense is going to be a huge deal, 100%. It's just if you are going to try and invest and make money off that, off publicly traded, securities, you do need to really do your due diligence. So certainly something you'll hear a lot about in the newspaper, something we'll see a fair amount, and hopefully, hopefully we don't. Somebody doesn't blow up a load of GPS satellites and we all end up turning into savages eating each other because the internet doesn't exist and no one knows where anything is, and banks can't make transactions. But it's certainly something we're going to see a lot more of in the future. Now, just looking further through the chat, we have got a very lively one this week, which is great to see. AJ says, earlier this week, I bought some gold bullion, or correction, gold ingots. Is this a good idea? Well, funnily enough, actually, I was actually given, for Christmas, I was actually given some whiskey that's called Aberfeldy 12 because it's called the Golden Dram. They put it in this very, this very aesthetic box. I've yet to try any, so I can't recommend it. But when it comes to gold bullion, John, we're both very much big fans of this.
Oh, yeah.
It's always a good time. If you don't own any gold, I always say it's time to buy gold. If you've not got any, you should always have a little bit. Of course, we can't give formal investment advice in this show. This is for informational purposes only. But in terms of owning gold and its investment properties, given the fact that we're talking about unconventional warfare, lots of chaos in places like Ukraine, we're talking about cyber attacks and space warfare, gold certainly has a certain attraction in that environment. Wouldn't you say, John?
Well, look, I mean, again, as you just mentioned, everyone should own some gold. Gold is a form of an insurance policy against, the more mainstream financial investable world not doing well for whatever reason. And if you're defensive, as I am, because I do see, and I saw this mix of stagflationary conditions building a couple of years back, and I've become progressively more defensive over the past year. Then not only do you want to own a small portion of gold as insurance, but you probably want to be owning even a bit more of that insurance than you normally would. Now, one thing though, which is curious, is that gold did not trade well last year and has not really done a whole hell of a lot this year. Now, it got a bounce this week, the first bounce I've seen this year. And to be fair, it's kind of overdue. You have these, as you mentioned, the inflation numbers coming out in the UK, and in the US for that matter. But in the UK here, we're at the highest since 1992 when we had, the big devaluation of sterling. And in the US, we're as high as the early 80s. So in any event, gold has every reason to be trading better now. It really, really does. I was scratching my head late last year. I just could not understand why gold had not already got into gear properly, but maybe that's finally happening now. And as you know, gold was my long, I believe, as early as, or as recently, excuse me, as our, was it last chat or one prior to that?
I think it was
I
one
think I
prior to
really
that.
highlighted precious metals again as an absolute steal here. Well, maybe finally they're starting to show some renewed interest.
Yeah, I feel, John, that the longer we don't see an enormous rally in gold, it only makes me more interested in the sector because it's certainly something that you don't see the financial press going on about a lot. You don't see an awful lot of chatter about it. Indeed, it wasn't too long ago, maybe a month ago, I remember the FT published an article saying, gold investors, they struggle to find relevance today because gold is, cryptocurrencies are here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, this kind of thing is, that kind of rhetoric is only makes me more bullish on it because you don't actually want what you're owning to be something that's uber popular because that generally means that you're going to be paying a pretty high premium for it. So if you are buying gold in this kind of environment where people aren't really talking about it very much, it's generally, I would say, a good thing to have on your side. But on the topic of gold and its great bounce this week, I think it would be good to discuss the current. We've seen some even greater inflation statistics this week. What do you think it is that's driven that bounce? Do you think it could have just been the inflation story? Because we are seeing also a lot of strength in oil now.
Some people would say that gold had reached a level of strong support on the charts. So some people just see it as kind of a technical bounce. That said, it did occur immediately following these inflation reports, and so you could say there was a fundamental reason for it. To be honest, it may be a combination of several factors, and simply the fact that that gold looks relatively cheap. You mentioned crypto. Um, it's debatable to what extent interest in crypto has placed headwinds on the gold price over the
Yep.
past year. There's some evidence that's the case. I don't think it's definitive. I think there's some evidence that's the case. If the shine does come off crypto here, and let's face it, crypto has not been trading well recently, then maybe, just maybe, that will lead to some general renewed investor interest in gold as the inflation hedge, the timeless inflation hedge, as it were, as opposed to just the one that happens to be cool and trendy at present. So maybe that's also a contributing factor. But again, I think it's very difficult to say that definitively. For what it's worth, by the metrics I follow, which are only medium term, not short term, high frequency trading metrics, but the ones that I follow, which have to do with long term real interest rates and the price of oil, energy, if you put them into a simple model, they're pointing to gold being north of 2000 now. That is just allowing gold to do what it normally does, would have it around $200 per ounce higher. And that's essentially 10% from where we currently are. And so that's a big deviation. So if you do want to get in on this and play it, I think now is a good time to not just own gold as insurance, but to also see it as a short-term speculative catch-up play to fair-ish value.
It is certainly. I think it's given everything that's going on at the minute. We've been talking about so many conflict themes, and indeed so much inflation that we see at the moment. We're seeing, I think it's 30-year highs was the latest print, and that was just the official print for inflation. So it's not even what many would argue is that it's a true rate of inflation. It does feel like precious metals will have their time in the sun at some point, if not soon. And if precious metals prices don't go up a huge amount, I think it's generally a good thing. I think you don't want the price of gold to go up a huge amount, because that generally means that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. So the longer that doesn't happen, it's generally quite a good thing. If you look at the great bull markets for gold post Bretton Woods and that, if you look at the 1970s, or if you're looking at immediately post financial crisis, this was not a very nice time for the common man. It was not you don't want to be the average Joe during the 1970s, and you wouldn't want to be the average Joe in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis either, because it's a very brutal time to be around. So, gold prices, you don't always want them to go up, except you only have it there as insurance. So you don't want to claim on the fire insurance on your house, but it's good to have it.
You don't, but you have to own it. That's the thing, right? So it's important just to be realistic, to take a look at history, to understand that we sometimes go through very, very difficult periods, both as an economy, society, and then, of course, as an investor. And it just is what it is. And my friend Brent Johnson frequently says that when gold finally goes to the moon, because he thinks someday it will, he's not going to be high-fiving anybody,
No.
because he knows that chances are when gold goes to the moon, people are going to be struggling, really struggling, and it won't be a pretty sight. That said, people that did expect gold to potentially go to the moon and held some of that insurance will be just that much better able to deal with what could be a pretty crappy set of socioeconomic conditions overall.
Yeah, big time. I mean, during that kind of period, you're going to be paying probably a very, very high amount for things like milk, or your basic the basic inputs on your life, and it's not going to be a very nice time. So, golden bull markets aren't always golden for everybody. Again, so many comments in the chat. We do have some questions regarding the scarf. There are further questions regarding the scarf. Are you trying to save money on gas, John? Given the rise in gas prices, this is what we're getting. Would you care to comment on that at all?
Look, I've mentioned this before. I happen to prefer a relatively cool room temperature environment, something which is borderline cellar temperature for most people. I actually find I just have a better attention span, more alert. I just, whatever. And so when I'm doing something like this, where I want to be alert and engaged, I just find it much more pleasant to do so in a pretty cool room, one that most people would find uncomfortably cool, perhaps. But it's just who I am. But yes, the temperature really dropped late this afternoon, and so I actually had to throw a scarf on to still make it pleasant even for me.
Oh well, don't worry, John. Looking very suave, bringing increasing the level of style that we do have on Southbank Live. We have some interesting comments regarding Russia and China. So, there is a comment here regarding from Michael here saying regarding China, Taiwan, and Russia and Ukraine, Xi Jinping and Putin met in December. I wonder what might have been on their agenda. Do you reckon there's any synergies there with Russia, Ukraine, and China, Taiwan? We were discussing earlier, John, how opportunistically military actors can take advantage of chaos in one part of the world to then move in another. Do you ever think that there would be something explicit to say, okay, well, you take Ukraine and then we'll take Taiwan? Because to me, that feels like something out of a Bond movie and wouldn't happen in real life.
Yes and no. I mean, you're absolutely right. Of course, it could make for a good Bond movie. And yet, back to what we discussed briefly earlier, history does demonstrate that countries do occasionally opportunistically act in ways to take advantage of what they see as the ability to achieve certain objectives that wouldn't be achievable on their own in a general peacetime where they're simply the aggressor to try to grab whatever it is they want, but where they take advantage of a more general conflict that distracts everybody else. And certainly it can't be lost on anyone that general Russian-Chinese cooperation is higher today than it has been historically. Now, it's important to put that in context because for many, many years, China and Russia did not get along at all. And it's a misconception in much of the West that just because both were under communist regimes for a long time, that they actually got on. They didn't get on at all. I mean, they went to war a couple times, even though both
Yeah.
of them were communist regimes. And to this day, they have some lingering border disputes, but those aren't hot border disputes, but they've never been fully resolved. And yet, that's what you see, right? That's the historical context. The fact is that Russia and China have moved closer, and it would astonish me if they weren't comparing notes. That is, what's happening on Russia's frontier in the west, what's happening on China's frontier in the South China Sea and Formosa, Taiwan area. Um, I'd be surprised if there wasn't at least the occasional exchange of what if sort of ideas. But again, I'm not an expert on this, and you're absolutely right. It would make for a better Bond film script than what's probably quite just a basic practical what if discussion they might have with each other from time to time.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be incredible to be a fly on the wall during such a discussion. I'm sure I imagine the atmosphere is very interesting indeed. But ultimately, we can only speculate. We can't. We'll probably never know what the contents of said discussions might be. We are getting on a little bit for time. I thought we'd before we get to our long short segment, just to close us off for this evening, and we have been discussing gold. We got a question from Sarah here, which I think is quite interesting. Does the gold standard or does gold in general still underwrite our currency? And Sarah also owns some gold. Now, this is a very interesting question. So, obviously, on a legal basis and in terms of explicitly, it's a no. Like, no, we don't back. Countries don't back their currencies with gold anymore, and they haven't for a very long time now. However, there is always the discussion of what's called a shadow gold standard, whereby you get national governments and their gold reserves, and you wonder whether or not the people who are buying this gold are buying it relative to the amount of currency that they have in issuance, whether or not they are, okay, well, when we were under the gold standard, we had this much. We're not under it anymore, but we're going to try and kind of follow it a little bit and build up our stores just in case something happens and we go back to that kind of system, or just as a prudent measure when it comes to, the financial responsibilities of a government for its citizens' savings. John, what do you make of that? Because the shadow gold standard idea, it's quite prevalent, but I've never seen any kind of mainstream acceptance for it.
Well, no, I mean, look, the way the international monetary system works, gold plays almost no role whatsoever.
And yet they
However,
all own gold, though.
yeah. However, this is the thing, though. All the same central banks, with only a couple exceptions, that held meaningful gold reserves under the Bretton Woods system. They pretty much, with a couple exceptions, almost all of them still do. And then you have lots of newer, younger countries that never had large holdings of gold that have been steady buyers for the last couple of decades, and in some
Yeah.
cases have built substantial gold reserves, especially when you compare those gold reserves to the size of their monetary base. And we've been talking about Russia here. Russia's gold reserves compared to the size of their monetary base are very substantial. I think it's over 70% now. I mean, that's at current market values. That is a big figure, and it's much bigger than what the U.S. ever had to back the dollar under Bretton Woods.
Yeah.
So I think it's saying a bit too much to say that there's this shadow gold standard, because that kind of implies an international system. However, I would say that the national interest in owning gold and adding incrementally to gold holdings has been on the rise, and it's been on the rise for a number of years now. And precisely why that's happening, look, every country is going to have its own explanation for why it's doing what it's doing, perhaps. But if that is the general trend, then it does tell you something. Countries are either A, uncertain about the future and the future of the dollar reserve system, which is the way the world currently works. They might be uncertain about the specific reserves that they're holding on their central bank balance sheet, and they want some credit risk-free diversification, credit and evaluation risk-free diversification. Gold's the only source to provide that is accepted internationally. And others may actually see it as a potential geopolitical weapon. Think about Russia. What if they're placed under sanctions? What if the US and other countries do try to boot them out of the SWIFT system so they can't access the international banking system? They're going to have to use something to pay for imports. Well, guess what? People would accept gold. So anyway, they're all different considerations, and yet all of them help to explain why central banks have generally been accumulating gold in recent years at a rate which is cumulatively the highest since Bretton Woods ever blew up in the first place.
They've got to have some reason for doing it. It's not just tradition, as Ben Bernanke.
Exactly. That summarizes my point perfectly. The fact is that when he gave that answer to that question, I mean, I just shook my head. I remember watching that and thinking, what? But let me get this straight. I mean, central banks are doing this just because they've always done it? No, that didn't explain anything.
Yeah, that was quite an answer to give. Very very bold by Ben Bernanke. But then they do feel that they are the masters of the universe, so maybe that goes with the territory. John, we are getting on a little bit for time, so I thought we could end today with our long short segment. For everybody watching, this is just where we take a look at what's been going on over the past week, and we give something, an asset, a behavior, a phenomenon, or other item that we are bullish on, and another which we are bearish on. John, what would you give for your long short this week?
Well, what I think is an interesting play here is, even though I'm defensive and contrarian, and I think we're entering into this stagflationary period. We already have the deflation part, right? We just haven't clearly gotten into the stagnation yet because of all the money that governments have been throwing around to support us through the COVID pandemic and lockdowns and whatnot that we're finally emerging from. But in any event, one thing that I follow is I follow all the industrial commodities. And one thing that I've seen is, of course, the huge sell-off in iron ore that took place in the second half of last year. But iron's bounced recently, and it looks like it's settling into a range. So I think that sell-off is over. Also, if you take a look at bulk shipping rates, now this is not true of container traffic. Containers are still very expensive to come by. But bulk shipping rates have really collapsed sharply over the past few months. And iron ore, to be fair, is one of the biggest, if not always the biggest contributor to bulk shipping cargoes. So, okay, this is an interesting one now because China is beginning to ease credit conditions. China's basically decided that their economic slowdown has gone far enough. It's causing a slowdown in the property sector and so on and so forth. I actually think we're at a potential, not necessarily major, but at least minor cyclical turning point where basic industrials and basic industrial activity has at least temporarily bottomed. Now, combine that with the inflation rolling through, which is finally leading to workers' demands for higher wages. And this includes emerging markets. There have been strikes at mining operations in multiple countries in recent weeks. But basic industrials tend to have pricing power. So if their workers demand higher wages, they'll be able to push that through to their consumers for those,
Yeah.
iron ore or whatever other raw industrial products we're talking about here. Now, that's an interesting combination because it could be that activity levels are bottoming and yet the pricing power is strong in that sector. It's a very unloved sector. It got really beaten up over, well, it's actually staged a small comeback recently. But I think basic industrials, mining firms, Caterpillar, and firms that make mining equipment, things like that. And we're not just talking about gold and silver miners. I'm talking about just general
Yeah.
basic industrials, aggregates, you name it, iron ore producers. I think that they suffered for several years. They've bounced recently, and I think it could be the beginning of a significant comeback. That would be my long. My short is still big tech. So I know it's a very unsexy, not cool, old-fashioned trade, but I think being long basic industrials and short big tech is a good position to hold here.
Yeah, it does. It does feel like basic industrials, having been, as you say, they've staged a bit of a comeback, but for a long period of time, the people who actually pull the stuff out of the ground, and which we then, enjoy in our consumer lifestyles, do seem to be incredibly unloved. And ultimately, during an inflationary environment, it's these guys who really get the mojo back, and which investors manage, go to in order to get some protection from it. So it does feel like a very interesting sector to be in right now. Though, of course, when you're talking about strikes and things like that, I imagine there's plenty of volatility that you're going to find there as well. Now, John, it has been a very interesting Southbank Live, as ever. Indeed, thanks so much for joining me this evening. And a big thank you, of course, to everybody who has tuned in to Southbank Live this evening. We have had a very lively chat. We haven't been able to go through all of the questions and all of the comments, but we do thank you all for tuning in. If you have any further questions, if you're watching a recording, do feel free to leave it in the comments when this YouTube video does just become a recording, and give us a like and a subscribe, please, if you would be so kind, as that does help us out. But John, thanks again for having us. Well, thanks again for having our questions and giving such erudite answers. Has been great as ever, and hopefully we'll be back soon with another episode.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. Until next time.
Have a good one, folks. Have a very good evening.